We are going to go through a few slides just to get a sense of the Battle of Ridgefield and kind of get the timeline of the battle. So as many of you know, or you've been talking about, things like the Battle of Brooklyn have already happened. And in 1772, the British are already in New York City. So they've already taken New York City. George Washington is now down in New Jersey. So he is kind of south of the city. But New York City, remember, is one of the two major cities in the colonies at this point in time. And up here in the north, it is the largest city. And so capturing New York City was kind of core to what the British wanted to do. They wanted to make sure that they captured our main cities for reasons of trade, for reasons of politics and policies, and controlling populations. I probably have to slow down on my talking, right? So in the summer of 1776, they had captured New York City. And so we're going to kind of start there, because a lot of times when we look at the Revolutionary War, we don't see Connecticut, right? You maybe see a couple of stories about Connecticut when we talk about Benedict Arnold. He's a famous general who fights for the Continentals and then switches sides and then fights for the British. And so that's why if somebody calls you a Benedict Arnold, they're calling you a traitor or a turncoat. But really, we don't have a lot of stories about the Revolution in Connecticut. So why Connecticut? Why was there even a battle here in Ridgefield? I know some of you in your comments said, why in Ridgefield? Ridgefield's such a small little place in the corner of Connecticut. We're not Hartford. We're not the town or the colony, rather the colony's capital. We're just this little in the corner of Connecticut, right close to New York, notice. But there's a major river that goes along the side of this map that isn't in this map, and that's the Hudson River. Now, the Hudson River cuts off New York from the rest of New England. And so what was happening was the British are down in New York and the British own Canada, but right in between are all the colonies. And the colonies are causing a lot of consternation, right? Particularly Massachusetts. So the British idea was, if we can cut around New York being a problem, if we can cut through Connecticut and get control of that whole Hudson River, remember they're going to go to Fort Ticonderoga later in the fall, right? September. So if I can cut through Connecticut around this mess of New York, oh, we're timed here. Why are we timed? Get through this mess of New York. We're going to go backwards. Then when we divide Massachusetts off and all these towns that are having all these problems, then perhaps we can stop this war. So even though we have George Washington down in New Jersey, the British are starting to move their intentions up through New York. Okay, so if you look on that curvy line that's going around Connecticut, Ridgefield's right on that line. Now, in terms of leadership, we have this very interesting character named General Tryon. He was the British leader. He was the royal governor of New York. And he becomes, when General Howe comes into New York, General Tryon then becomes in charge of all of the Continental troops that are moving through New England. So he is in charge of the troops that are going to come through Connecticut. Then for our Patriot leaders, we have General David Worcester, who is in charge of the militia. And remember, the militia are soldiers that gather from towns for the purpose of protecting their area. They do not muster and go off to George Washington. So the militia stay local. Benedict Arnold is the general who is in charge of the Continental troops, the actual soldiers whose job it is to be a soldier, essentially. So when we talk about the Battle of Ridgefield, we have to keep in mind that the British are trying to control the Hudson. Connecticut, at this time, remember I said it took Ridgefield 3 votes to determine that they want to fight for independence. So Connecticut is really quite loyal at this point to the crown. And so the British down in New York say, you know what, this is probably our best bet, because Connecticut still has great trade with England. Connecticut's still largely loyal to the crown. So Connecticut, we can kind of just sneak through. And as they go through, they had received word, they had received some reports from spies in the area that Danbury was a depot for supplies for the Continental Army. And so they're like, well, as we swing through Connecticut, we can just hit up Danbury Depot. We'll destroy their stores, all their warehouses, everything that they've been collecting for the Continental Army, and we'll weaken the Continental Army in Connecticut. So on April 24th, the British are going to land at Campo Beach in Westport. So it's farther south down at the bottom of the map. And then they're going to start their march. And they're going to march all the way up that right-hand side of the map and arrive in Danbury. Okay, so Danbury is just north of us here in Ridgefield, but for you guys, it's, what is that, Never Eat Soggy Waffles, west. Am I correct on that one? See, this is really hard to present when I can't see your faces. I'll get used to it. Okay, so the British make it up to Danbury. And along the way, remember that there's troops, or not really troops, just citizens of Connecticut on both sides. So this house here that I'm in, Keeler Tavern, was a Patriot house. But right next door, the next house over that you cannot see, but I can, was a Loyalist house. So it was literally every other person. So as they're marching through, they're gathering troops for the British, but they're also alerting the Patriots. Okay, so all these people, all the militia that are in the area are getting word that the British are moving through. And so they're sending out their different either spies or different reports to other people in the area to say, hey, the British are now here in Connecticut. So the Patriots arrived outside of Danbury. Unfortunately, on the 26th, it had been cold and rainy, and so gunpowder doesn't work the best when it's wet. Doesn't work at all, actually. And so the Patriots had the idea that they could gather enough people as they were marching up to Danbury and be able to engage. But unfortunately, with wet gunpowder, you really can't engage, and the militia in Danbury was only 150 people. Now, the British, when they landed at Cannonball Beach, they had about 1,200 people. They had a few soldiers that are going to stay behind so that when the troops come back, they can protect them if there's any sort of engagement going on, but it's about 1,200 that march up to Danbury. So when we talk about a soldier, we're talking about three kind of different types of soldiers here. We're talking about the British, we're talking about the Continentals, and we're talking about militia. If we have time, I want to keep my eye on the time because as you can tell, I talk a lot. So I can take up a lot of time if I'm not careful. So I'm going to show you this picture, and if we have time at the end, this lovely gentleman here, his name is Jan, Master Desiato, he has a short video of putting on all of the accoutrements that you would need as a soldier marching. So you see he is dressed as a civilian. So his clothing is what a civilian would wear. Next to him is the British officer uniform, which is white and red. It was usually white wool. Wool is water repellent, which means it's kind of waterproof, not quite. Warm in the winter, cool in the summer. It's great material. And then you see we have some regimental uniforms. And that's also what's behind me is a Continental uniform. The blue jacket is a regimental uniform, also wool. I really like clothing, just like your teacher, I like costume. And so you're gonna end up hearing a whole bunch about costume along the way here today, just because that's something I'm very excited about. So I wanna pause for a second because there's a great story here. As the British have moved up to Danbury, and that word has gone out to all of the militia and the Continental troops in the area, the word gets out over to New York, where Colonel Ludington has a daughter named Sybil. And Sybil Ludington takes the responsibility of going through the towns on the edge of Connecticut here and rallying the troops. She was much like the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, let's say. And unfortunately, she rides 40 miles through the night, that cold, wet, rainy night when the militia can't use their weapons because it's soggy gunpowder. That's the night she's riding and trying to gather as many people as they can. They were hoping to slow down the British on their return to the coast and engage them in a formal battle. And so all these different militia are being gathered from all sorts of areas around Danbury to try and engage the British. Unfortunately, Sybil's father gathers his troops because of her actions, and they end up at the tail end of the retreat, the British retreat. So they're not really here for the Battle of Ridgefield, but it's that night before the Battle of Ridgefield that she is riding her heart out, trying to gather as many troops as she possibly can for her father, who was a colonel in the militia. So on April 27th, the British decide to leave Danbury. They've marched up to Danbury, they capture the stores that they want, meaning the supplies and things that they want, and then they go ahead and they burn anything they're not taking with them. So they burn any supplies that can be sent to support Continental troops. This included medical supplies, tents, clothing, shoes, and then they start their march back down. So they take a different route because they know the route they've been marching along, that's where all the Continentals have been gathering. and they're going to march down towards Ridgefield. Now, Worcester is going to engage with General Worcester. Remember, he's on the Continentals. He's the leader of the militia. He's going to engage with the British. He's going to engage with General Tryon, right kind of north of where that, see where it says first engagement, just above Ridgefield. So he's going to engage with the British, but not in lines. One of the things I noticed that a few people mentioned was how chaotic it looked in the Battle of Ridgefield. And it was kind of chaotic because people were constantly moving. And so you're walking down these roads that are fairly narrow here in colonial towns, and you're not going to stop and line up and engage with each other on two lines. And so General Worcester is engaging kind of at the tail end of the columns, of the marching columns, and he's just trying to slow them down so that the other troops, including Benedict Arnold, have enough time to gather to formally engage. So, oh, I'm supposed to check my phone. What am I checking my phone for? One kid wants to know. Oh, you guys, this is tricky, this whole digital teaching thing. Did she ride more than Paul Revere? Yes, she did. She rode nearly double, I believe, Paul Revere. Isn't that correct? Yes, but I'm asking you for confirmation. I'm supposed to be talking to you, but I was looking at my coworker, my boss is here, asking her for confirmation. Yes, she rode farther than Paul Revere. Technically speaking, she did. And she did not have a partner in crime. Paul Revere rode with, he had a partner in crime. Who was his? Oh, you guys are challenging me. I do not remember the name, but there was another gentleman that rode that same night. Oh, and somebody asks, why does the map say the forgotten general? That's a good question. Because this battle is forgotten. None of you guys knew about it, right? So this whole story, as much as I think it's exciting, and as much as Sybil Ludington is really exciting and engaging, and she was young, she was 16, I believe. So not much older than you guys. And this is what her life was. Her father was a colonel in a militia. His job was to rally men to go to war in Connecticut. And so her whole world as a 16-year-old is a very dangerous place. And yet she had the bravery, the gumption, the determination to go out on a freezing cold, rainy night in support of the cause for independence and liberty. You know, I think that unfortunately this story gets lost, but you guys know how hard it is in history class to try and learn everything there is to learn about history, right? We can't tell you everything, and we can't teach you everything. That would take a long, long time. So there are so many of these small stories, local stories like this across the country that are part of our whole national fabric, a part of our whole national history that do get lost. And so the forgotten general is General Worcester and all that he did. And unfortunately, I can't really turn the computer right now, but if I could, the portrait that I showed you of General Worcester, oh, look at this. I'm having permission. Students, I'm a museum professional. You are not allowed to touch paintings without gloves unless you're a trained professional. Understand? So this is General Worcester. And if you notice, he's not wearing a blue coat. General Worcester was a Worcester during the French and Indian War as well. And so during the French and Indian War, he wore a red coat, right? Because the British were protecting the colonies. I hope you guys can see this. And so General Worcester gained fame during the French and Indian War for protecting the colonies, protecting here in Connecticut during the French and Indian War. But then when the fight for independence came, he decided for himself and his family that it was more important to fight for independence than continue to be loyal to the king. So he becomes kind of this forgotten entity, and this battle becomes a forgotten story, even though it is important for the overall arc of American history. Does that make sense? Okay, I heard you cannot see me. Okay, got it. You're just looking at a slide. Oh, Hildy, give that back. I need like an alarm. How do we do this? Stop sharing. Can you see me now?
Unless we'll email it to them.
Okay, I got a thumbs up that you can see me now. So I'm showing you this lovely picture and telling you this lovely, passionate story about General Worcester, and you couldn't see the poor man. So here I was saying, you know, what color his jacket is, and you had no idea. I'm sorry. So this is General Worcester, and it's dark. I know. if I hold him out farther. And the other tricky thing about this is that it's a really interesting artifact. Can I hold or shine camera on it? Can you shine? Yeah. Do you have a camera light? The other tricky thing about this painting is it's actually a reverse painting on glass. So the artist painted on the reverse side of a piece of glass. So they painted the whole thing as a mirror image. So you're getting a lot of reflection on this. So I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it because you'll get a lot of reflection on it. Can you see it at all? We'll take a picture and send it to your teacher. Okay. So painting on glass has its own challenges. All right. Are you seeing me or are you seeing my computer again? Yes, me. Okay. Oh my gosh, you guys must be cracking up over me. All right, so the Battle of Ridgefield. So now we've gotten the British down to Ridgefield. They've had their first engagement kind of north in Ridgefield at that first star. Their second engagement, General Worcester is injured. He is mortally wounded. He's shot in the back, it is, I believe. And he actually, really interesting side note, he is transported back up to Danbury, and he is actually put in the house that General Tryon was staying in the night before. And he's put there to kind of convalesce in hopes that he'll survive the night, and he doesn't survive the night. But the same house that hosted General Tryon one night hosts a dying General Worcester the next night. Very interesting, I think. Okay, now I'm told I have to present screen again. But how do I do that? Guys, this is such a learning curve. Hit share screen. Thank you, Colin. There should be a button to present. Yes, guys, I know, but I had to get out of the PowerPoint first, and then I had to come back over to Google Meet, and then I have to click the present in Google Meet, and then I have to go back over to the PowerPoint. Now see? There you go. I can do this. You're just supposed to say, come on, Mrs. Houston or Mr. Houston, you can do this. All right, Battle of Ridgefield. Now I have to present again. See, all these clicky buttons. Man, I wish I could just come to your classroom, but I'm glad you're here. All right, so that's our tavern. That is the tavern from the outside. And if you look closely, who's going to use their powers of observation for me? If you look really closely at the far left-hand window, there's a small square of discolored shingles on the house. And that's where there's a secret, and we're going to show that to you in a minute. But that is our evidence of the Battle of Ridgefield here in this very building. So this is the main door to the house. If you're entering the house, we have another door. If you're entering to the tavern, you would come in through what's called the tap room door. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to Timothy Keeler, who is the owner of the tavern. And he's going to tell his story about the Battle of Ridgefield and what he experienced here in the town of Ridgefield during April 27th.
Hi folks, Timothy Keeler here to tell you about the Battle of Ridgefield, or the best I can remember it. I wasn't there for all of it. But we know that the Battle of Ridgefield was on April 27th, 1777. It was a Sunday, right around lunchtime, or just after lunch for some of us. But on April 26th, that Saturday, we knew that the British were up in Danbury. And we had been warned by riders that we should be ready just in case something happened on Sunday and the British left up there in Danbury, that they didn't come south and come to see us, which is indeed what they did. But we had a kind of restless night that Saturday night. And Sunday morning, we got up and made some more preparations. Some of the men with wives and small children took off and went elsewhere. And some of us stayed in there until the last minute. Around 10:30 in the morning, Colonel Benedict Arnold shows up himself, that prissy son of a gun. And he decided that we should set up a barricade at the end of our main street, and we could maybe deter the British or force them to go around the village. That was the idea. We didn't know how many British there were, but it sounded like a good idea to us, and he was a colonel, so we listened to him. And we set up a barricade down at the end of our main street, maybe half a mile down from where we presently stand. And in that barricade, we put out plows and wagons, and firewood and anything we could throw out there to block the street. Well, about noon, the British started to come. We could hear the fifes in the distance. We could hear the drums. We could hear musket shots ringing out far to our north, up North Salem Road. And at that point, Colonel Arnold told the rest of the men from town, if you have wives, you have children, I want you to get out of here. Let's let the militia and the regular Continental soldiers fight this battle. And so that's when I took off. I took my wife and our youngest daughter, and then we had a baby son too, David, that we took out. He was still in a crib at that point. And we got out. The men got behind the barricade. There were probably 300 men by the time the British came around the corner at about noon or 12:30. But there were 2,000 British. Nobody had any idea that there would be that many. 300 against 2,000, even behind the barricade. So the British came right down Main Street for that first little initial foray into the village. And they were pushed back. Arnold got his men to stand up and push back, and they stopped that first invasion. Now, about 2 or 3 minutes later, the British came again, but this time on 3 sides. They were to the south from South Street. They were to the north coming from Titicus, and they converged on that barricade from 3 sides, forcing all the occupants to get out. And all the Patriots at that point took off and ran down Main Street and away from the battle. Just before that, Arnold tried to rally the men one more time and had a horse shot out from underneath him. He managed to escape into the bushes as well. Had he been killed that day, he might have been a hero to us, but as it turned out, it was otherwise. We won't go into his story at this moment. So the British came and they moved into town. And they looked around and they found up at St. Stephen's Church some supplies for the Revolution. And so they pulled them out and they burned some of them in the street. They also set up some little cannons they had brought with them. They were ship's cannons. They were 3-pounders. Maybe the whole cannon was about this long and maybe about this high. And it shot a solid ball, 3 pounds. It was used ship to ship to knock the mast off another ship. But General Tryon of the British thought he'd bring 3 of those cannons up at the front of his lines and 3 at the back just to make noise and scare people. And they did a fine job of that. So then Tryon said, when he heard that the Patriots met in my tavern upstairs here, he said, let's see if we can't shake some of those Patriots out of the tavern. So sure enough, he got those 3-pound cannons, and they started pelting cannonballs down this way. Well, the first one went into an old kitchen that was now a dining room, knocked over a small candle, started a little fire, no big deal. But it got everybody's attention, and the couple of people that were still in the tavern at that point pretty much left. There were 2 fellows upstairs that were militiamen, and they were going to stay until the end. And they also had a good vantage point up on that 2nd floor to watch what the British were doing up in the middle of town. Well, the second cannonball came in, and this one was right into a corner post into the current dining room, the big formal dining room, but it stayed outside. One of those folks from upstairs, the militiamen, came down to see what had happened and where that cannonball hit. Evidently, a cannonball that hits your house at 200 miles an hour makes a big racket. Well, who would have known? Well, we figured out that day that that was the truth. And so this fellow came down and looked around in the dining room, couldn't find any damage at all, unaware that the ball was stuck still outside right into that 8x8 white oak corner post that served so well to support the building. So he was on his way up the stairs to go back up to his nest and to report that he couldn't find any damage from the cannonball, even though they knew full well that he had hit. They heard it. And as he was on his way up those stairs, he was about the 4th or 5th step up when the 3rd cannonball came in. Right above the front door, the one that's heading toward where the church and the green is. And that ball went between his legs and into the wall, but it didn't hit him. What did hit him was a big shower of splinters. On a Navy ship, they might call that, "Arr, shiver me timbers." A shiver is a splinter. And when that metal cannonball hits that wood, boy, what a shower of splinters. And this fella got his timbers shivered, and he fell down to the bottom step. His other friend, still up in that top bedroom window, watching the British advance, yelled down, "Are you all right?" Worried about his friend? Well, his friend, poor friend, who had his timber shivered, laying on the ground, cuts and bruises all over him, yells up, "I am killed." Well, we knew that wasn't the truth because he was yelling. So his friend came down and picked him up and tried to dust him off a little bit. Checked out all the splinters in his face, in his hair, everywhere there were splinters. And they looked out the windows on each side of the door over there, and they saw the British coming. 12 or 14 British soldiers were coming. Their muskets were ready. Their bayonets were fixed. And they were coming this way. Well, I'll tell you, those two guys took off out of the tavern door, and they ran so fast and so quickly that they got out there almost in like a minute. The British came in, the tavern was completely open and empty. No one was in it. And they basically retired and set up camp. The British did all up and down Main Street and around this corner and then down West Avenue, West Lane. They sat up down there too. And they camped overnight. Now the next morning, which is now Monday morning, April 28th, the British are a little peeved at having fought a little battle down there at the barricade. And it's said that 16 men were killed there, 16 British and 8 Americans. I'm not quite sure of the count. But I know that some people died there, and nobody's quite sure how many exactly died. General Worcester, who was chasing the British from the back of the column, was mortally wounded on Sunday. We didn't really know that until later on in the night. He was brought back to Danbury, where he died 5 days later. The British decided, I guess that next Monday morning, that they were going to burn the tavern down in retaliation for all this stuff. And so they started a fire on a couple of different sides of the tavern, but the wind was blowing that day from the northwest to the southeast, and that was blowing a good 50, 60 miles an hour. So that flames on the south side of the house started to hit the Tory house next door. That belonged to my Uncle David Hoyt. And he was so concerned about his house being consumed by the flames that he ran in to the town, found General Tryon there, and got permission to put that fire out. He, after all, had been a good Tory all these years, and he didn't want to see his investment and his house burn up with that of a patriot or a rebel, as I used to like to call him. Well, we got the fire put out, and Uncle David's house was safe too. The men came back a day or two later, some of them, to see what had happened. And Timothy, that Tuesday afternoon, was walking around the house looking at the burn marks here. And so I went around there and I was walking, and Uncle David came over and said, "Timothy, you see, a Tory has saved your house this day," and explained to me the story of how the wind was blowing and how he got permission to put the fire out. And my reply to him was, "Thank you, Uncle David. Well, let's put it this way, Uncle David. I will thank God. I'll thank the north wind, but I don't think I'll ever thank a Tory for anything." Fortunately, Uncle David came around to the Patriot way of thinking sometime later on, and was allowed to stay in town after the war was over. That's basically what I remember about the Battle of Ridgefield.
Now, the people who are here in their homes, Esther, for example, was in her 20s. She was young. She had a daughter who was about 3 and an infant son. So she's got small children. And imagine you're in your home and you're hearing cannons, you're hearing gunfire, you're hearing shouts, you're hearing cries. You know people are dying. You know people are getting injured. You know property is getting damaged, and you're in your home. It's not like you can hop in your car and drive to grandma's. Okay, this is a dangerous situation. And so many of the women and children would go down to their basements. Now, again, we don't have a journal or anything written out that says Timothy Keeler did exactly this or Esther did exactly this. But we know that when those cannons were used again, after they broke the barricade, the British marched farther down Main Street and they opened fire with their cannons again. A cannonball, actually 2 cannonballs, struck this tavern. So imagine that you're 20-something years old, you have a baby and a 3-year-old, and you're in your basement, and a cannonball hits the building. This was a very scary time for these people, and it was I just get goosebumps thinking about it, that you're very trapped in a sense, and you're hoping the best. I'm sure you're hoping that the Continentals win, but you know that that means heavy engagement and heavy losses. You're hoping the British leave, but that means for us here at the tavern, they have to march right by. And they do. The British do, at the end of the day, they do march right by the tavern, and they camp farther south of the tavern. And they stay overnight. And the Continentals engage them the whole way. So the militia and the Continental Army engage them all the way down Main Street. So one of the cannonballs, I'm going to do the whole present your screen, and hopefully you guys can still hear me. Fiasco again. And I'm going to show you there is a cannonball still stuck. Oh, thank you. There's a cannonball still stuck in the building today. And there's the cannonball. Now, this is a small cannonball. This is what, 3 pounds was it? It wasn't a 6-pound shot. It's a 3-pound shot. So it's 3 pounds of solid metal. And that is the corner post of the house. So the whole house is resting on this corner beam, and smack dab in the middle of that corner beam is this cannonball. It's fantastic, isn't it? I love it. It gets me really excited to think about, there's the evidence of this battle. Like, this may be a forgotten battle. We may have forgotten generals, but it's there. The evidence of it is here, which is really, really cool. So someday, when we all can travel about and the museum's back open again, you should definitely come and check it out. It's a very, very cool thing to see and realize how close we were to this battle and how close, the American Revolution came to us. This is the London Gazette's version of the Battle of Ridgefield. And the first thing that should pop out to your eyes, if you're just looking at it, don't try to read it. You're just looking at it. The first thing that should pop out to your eyes is that there's a list. And the list is all of the supplies, all of the numbers of things. So if you look through that list, see if I have it here a little bit bigger, there should be things that you recognize. Things, food supplies, medical supplies, remember we mentioned. And that's what the British were after, right? And then if you look at the next chunk is everyone who was killed, wounded, missing. So if you are the British and you are reporting how the Battle of Ridgefield went, you notice on the left-hand column, it's kind of the narration, the narrative of it. It's the report. It's actually the military report, the official report of the battle. And after they go through the official report of the battle, then they list, here's all the things we captured or destroyed, and here's all the people we killed or captured, okay? So it's very much task-oriented, right? This newspaper is saying, here's where we marched, here's who we met, here are the generals that were there, here's what we captured, here's who we killed. Now, the small, really cool thing at the bottom of this page, if you can, there's a little stamp, and that stamp is an actual stamp, as in the Stamp Act. So every time you bought a piece of paper, the Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods. So every time you bought one, in order to show that you paid your tax to the king, they would stamp your paper. And so that's a Stamp Act stamp, which I think is pretty cool. And this on the right-hand side is just showing you kind of what those stamps looked like. They were also used to seal letters, because sending letters, the stamp that went on a letter to send it today originated as these kinds of stamps. It would seal the letter, and in order to break the seal of the letter to receive your letter, you had to pay a tax. And that was how you would unseal the letter. You knew you paid your tax, you could get your letter, you could get your mail. So this is just the Connecticut Journal, and just if you're looking at it side by side, notice there's no list of things that they destroyed or supplies they gathered or people they killed. It's completely narrative. And when students come here on campus, when we have field trips, they get to read it. And it's really, you should The language is much more positive and look at what we did, and this is how the militia was able to rally so quickly, and we were able to meet the British when we were unprepared, and yet we engaged them. It's a very positive telling of the story. So both of these newspapers had a purpose, right? So the British are trying to show their point of view, right? It could be considered propaganda, right? That they're trying to persuade their point of view. And the Connecticut Journal is going to try to persuade the continental point of view, right? They're going to show it in the light that makes them look best, right? So both have a checklist that they're trying to show. They're just showing it in very different ways. And so when we talk about the aftermath, this slide just gives you some idea of the killed and wounded or captured, and some of the kind of short non-answers to who won. Because just like life today, just like the world we're living in today, it's not black and white, right? It's not an either or situation. A lot of battles weren't, and they decisively won. A lot of our life isn't, and it's decisively this one thing, right? We're a mixture. And so this battle was like that. It was a mixture of experiences. It was a mixture of outcomes. And so it's not clear when scholars look at this. You could argue it either way. So it's not clear that the British won. They achieved their goals, but do they ever come into Connecticut again? No. They never come through Connecticut, as was their ultimate goal, to cut around through Connecticut and get the Hudson. They never do that. They do go along the coastline, and they continue to raid along the coastal cities and disrupt trade for Connecticut, but they don't ever cut through or make it all the way through to the Hudson River. So that goal isn't achieved. However, destroying the storehouses, as you saw, is achieved, right? They marched up to Danbury. Their small goal was destroy everything in Danbury. Don't let the Continentals have these supplies. We don't want this being sent to New Jersey to George Washington. That was achieved. And for the Continentals, this was a real trial, because Connecticut had mustered troops already, and they had been sent to George Washington already. So most of the troops from Connecticut that had already been mustered or already called up, the people who had already signed up, were down in New Jersey. And so they weren't able to come home to protect their homesteads. That was up to the militia, and how quickly townspeople could gather together and engage the British Army, which is pretty fantastic. And the damage that the British did after the Battle of Ridgefield, the next month, I think it's the next 2 months actually, over the next 2 months, 3,000 additional Connecticut citizens sign up for the Continental Army. So there was a huge outpouring of support for Ridgefield and Danbury and the events that happened here, and an anger turned towards England. And a lot of people decided, you know what, this is worth it. It's worth it to fight for liberty and freedom, even though there's these hard, high risks for us. And so it was kind of both, right? And that's the hard thing about history. Somebody asked, why do we need to learn this? And what am I going to get out of this for the rest of my life? And for me, looking back on history, it's all about learning that life is very much the same, and we have the same decisions to make. And these people we hold to high standards, like George Washington, the founding fathers, they were all mixed up and mired up in the mess that is life, just like we are. And so, the challenge is to look at these people as real people, understand that they lived a life and they made choices, and we are living and making choices too. And it's good to know that not everything is going to come out to be a clear decision. Like the British aren't always going to win, or the Continentals aren't always going to win. You're not always going to win when you argue with your parents. Your parents aren't always going to win when they argue with you. And those are the kinds of lessons that you learn from history, the life lessons of our lives are the same but different, and we can still learn from people no matter how many hundreds of years ago they lived.